I want to talk about where I feel like they missed opportunities that could have just been tweaked so we could have gotten some good moments in the show. And unfortunately, a lot of the issue is just off-screening really important moments for the characters. Episode 1 that I mentioned will be the only thing where I do a massive change because it's just the setup, and I think the setup's bad. But the rest of it, starting with episode 2, is just going to be adjustments to the scenes that we got. This isn't going to be a whole fan fiction. It's mainly going to be they could have done a slightly different thing, and I think the scene would have been a lot more interesting, other than episode 1, because the setup is its own thing. This video is for my full-length video on my channel, and I'll put the link in the description. That video has 4 segments, and this is one of them. You can check it out there if you want to watch the full thing. Thanks. The whole first episode, which is like the setup for the season, especially if you want to get more of the normie mainstream Star Wars audience in, I really think the show could have used like a Lord of the Rings style scene where it starts off with a flashback and you get a ton of information in like 5-10 minutes. And this scene could be something like a live action version of the end of Rebels, or they could even tweak it if they want, where we see Thrawn bearing down the Rebels to where they're on the verge of victory, and then Ezra has to sacrifice himself to save them from them. And this would show a regular audience how imposing Thrawn is as the rebellion is being crushed beneath him, and then the bravery of Ezra sacrificing his life as a teenage kid. And then you could get the reactions from Hera and Sabine to show their connection to Ezra too. And obviously you could include more dialogue and whatever, but I think something like that would have really served to help the mainstream Star Wars audience to start the season. And then you can cut to a couple years. We could see Sabine and Ahsoka trying to function as a master and apprentice. And however their falling out happened, we could see it on screen, which is something that even if you saw Rebels, no one really knows what happened. They just kind of vaguely allude to it not working out because of a personality clash. And I think this is a big mistake also to off-screen, because this is kind of the crux of their conflict for the entire season, and it takes place off-screen. I just don't understand why. And I think this would have really set the show up better than just a couple Dark Jedi mowing down red shirts and Ahsoka finding this orb with a map and killing a couple of droids that have nuclear explosions as a self-destruct mechanism. I think having the entire story hinge on this orb is just a colossal mistake, and that would obviously be a huge change you'd have to make. But I could have lived with something, just some exposition of Sabine saying that she's been chasing down hyperspace maps into wild space or whatever, and maybe she's even a bit dark about it and kind of ruthless. And they can do the thing where they say that they calculated the trajectory of Ezra's hyperspace route until a certain point and blah, blah, blah. So then she was pursuing leads on intergalactic hyperspace drives when she accidentally ran into Morgan Elsbeth. Morgan, Balin, and Shin could torture her for the information that she has about the hyperspace routes, and then she ends up giving it to him but escapes and links up with Ahsoka and Hera to get back to the hyperspace ring that she accidentally came across over her years looking for leads into the other galaxy. And that's just pretty much off the top of my head. Obviously there's a million ways you could do it, but I think doing something like that, you really could have built up a lot of animosity between the villains for the season and Sabine and Ahsoka and Hera. It kind of really gotten everybody involved and seen Sabine's commitment to Ezra, and then she'd have a reason to hate Morgan, Balin, and Shin. And I think it makes more sense that she came across the hyperspace ring looking for leads to Ezra than just Hera and Sabine cut this droid's head off to this one specific plant, and it just happened to have a shipment going right to this hyperspace ring at the same time that they put a tracker on, and it didn't get rid of the tracker before it got to the hyperspace ring. To me, I would have done the setup completely differently. But from this point on, it's just going to be me talking about tweaks to different scenes and things that I think should have been on screen that were off screen. So episode 2, I'm just going to skip because honestly, it's all kind of pointless except for the tracker and them finding out about the Imperial stuff happening at the plant. And that doesn't really even lead to anything later. It's not used for evidence or anything. So I'm just going to move on to episode 3. For episode 3, I would have had Hera just have evidence with her from the factory. And I also would have had the council just trust her judgment as one of the Republic's longest and highest standing generals since the beginning of the rebellion. And for Hera, I think it would have made a lot more sense if the council trusted her and then she had to decide whether to go or not. I think it would have been much more suited to her character because in Rebels, she was the one pushing to join a more organized rebellion so that they could make a bigger difference in the galaxy. And this is the push that she makes because she's like, there's only so much the 5 of us can do. Like, we need resources, we need connections. And if you go the route where she chooses to go legally, I think you could have done a really nice scene between her and Jason where she's torn between her son and her duty. And that's a really basic message that I think resonates with a lot of people. It makes sense for her character. If you want to go a little bit further with that, they could do the whole thing where Jason really wants to go with her and she's like, you're not ready yet. You're still a kid. I've already lost your dad. I can't lose you too, blah, blah, blah. And even just this kind of simple story, I think would be way more in line with her character and much more interesting than what we got. And then you also cut out the government corruption of the Republic. And she wouldn't have to get suspended later on. This is also the episode where we get introduced to the Sabine pursuing the Jedi route. And I think it would have been a much more logical and better arc for her if the lesson of accepting herself for who she was her arc, and not needing to become someone else and not needing to become a Jedi. Because she's already good at a bunch of stuff. She's a good warrior. But obviously this gets undone at the end because they choose to do an everyone can use the Force thing. And depending on what their disagreement was about between her and Ahsoka, because we don't really know, we could have had a nice moment where they reconciled and accepted each other for who they each are. Whatever. Or Ahsoka could do the whole, I was waiting for you to realize that you couldn't be a Jedi and be proud of who you are, blah, blah, blah type thing. Whatever. There's a lot of ways that they could have went with it that weren't, let's make Sabine the Jedi Mandalorian, even though she never used the Force before. The rest of episode 3 is the space fight, and obviously Ahsoka outside the ship was the worst part. The space fight could have been more interesting, even if they had done something like put the whales right at the entry point of the hyperspace lane, or if they had come out of hyperspace closer to the planet, so they weren't just flying in open space, getting shot over and over and over, and the ship is pretty much indestructible until it's convenient for them to get in the center of the hyperring, which for some reason is a blind spot in the hyperring. If the whales had been closer, if they were going to go this route, you could even have a line from Morgan saying like, ignore the whales, just get ready for the hyperspace jump, blah, blah, blah. And then you get a chase scene through the whales. So I keep saying whales, obviously I mean Purrgil. You could even have Shin and the villain pilots kill some of the whales in their pursuit because they're the villains. They don't care about animals and whatever. We could learn something about Shin there. Or you could have her do the opposite where she's trying to avoid hitting him and killing him because it's not necessary. Either way, we would get something from it. And it would make the scene more believable. Like, to me, what they did is like the equivalent of if you're having an on-foot pursuit by guys with guns chasing someone through an open field versus having them run through a city where they can turn down alleyways and run through apartments and climb up ladders and whatever. And obviously, if we went with my version where Hera is here legally, or, we kind of reconstruct the first episode, she could be flying the Ghost and we could see her piloting skills, but we don't really get to see any of that. So episode 4, I don't really have a huge issue with the first fight scene without getting into specifics, which is not what I want to do here. But it would have been nice if maybe they had done something with Ahsoka and Sabine trying to work together in a 2-on-2, and maybe they mess each other up and get in each other's way, and then they decide to work separately because they work better. But, still set it up for later on where they're actually like a tag team. And it also would have been a nice touch if maybe Sabine asked Ahsoka if she could fight Merrick instead because Shin stabbed her already. Or maybe even she was trembling at the beginning of her fight with Shin, because she got stabbed by her like a couple days ago as far as the in-story timeline goes. Ignoring Sabine's lack of force and Shin just not choking her, I do like Sabine using all her Mando stuff here. And it would have been nice if one of them had gotten hurt instead of Shin just being like, see ya. Like Sabine getting hurt, she could show up after Shin gets back. Or if you have Shin get hurt, she would have an excuse to flee. And then there'd be a little bit of animosity between the two because then they had both hurt each other. Especially if they had gone old school and she had cut like Sabine's leg off in the first fight or something. And she had to go in the back to tank and get a robot leg and all that. Or, they could have Sabine cut Shin's hand off as Star Wars tradition dictates. And then she could distract her with the Force and run back to Baylan. And we could kind of emphasize how much she really relies on Baylan as this kind of mentor, father figure, protector. Because she's not quite coming to her own yet. I think all that stuff could have been nice. I think it also could have been kind of neat if when Sabine had showed up to the fight between Baylan and Ahsoka, if Baylan had the location of the orb and Sabine fought him, but either she had to flee because he was too powerful, or he just fended her off and then got on the ship, and then she could use her jetpack to pursue them and sneak onto the hyperring. And this also would have saved her character from reigniting a galactic civil war just for the possibility of seeing Ezra. And even if you want to go the route of Sabine choosing to give Baylan the orb, I really think would have given it some weight if she admitted prior to this that she was in love with Ezra and couldn't live without him, and she couldn't change her path until she knew for sure that he was gone type thing. But obviously they undercut that with Ezra saying, I've always seen you as my little sister, in his hologram. I know we don't want romance in Star Wars anymore, but I think it would have been really beneficial here. And then you could at least empathize with her desire to be with the man she loves. More than anyone, she's pursued him for a decade. She's exhausted all resources, blah, blah, blah. Instead of just like her buddy. Especially with the reaction that we get when they meet up finally in a couple episodes here. Ahsoka episode 5 is the Hayden episode. And to me, this was the biggest missed opportunity of the series with this dumbass live or die thing. It would have been so much better if in her mind she had been fighting him. And she talks about how she feels like she failed Anakin, and maybe Anakin tells her that he failed everyone or whatever, and that he still believes in her, and she can go, whatever route you want to go with it. It would have been so nice to see an actual conversation here, instead of just him saying live or die over and over. And they could have talked about the great times they had, and what they both wished that their relationship could have become as Jedi and apprentice in the future, and what could have been. Maybe Anakin could ask how Luke was, how Leia was, since the key moment for Darth Vader's arc was choosing to be a father over power. You could even do the thing where Anakin says he will still always be there to support her through the Force. And maybe at this point in the story, when they leave this place, she sees his Force Ghost smiling or whatever, instead of at the very end of the series, which I think makes a lot more sense. And this also would have been a lot more impactful than what we got. And they could even have him fighting against his own urges to turn to the dark side throughout the episode, where he turns dark with the Sith eyes and fights her, and then when he has control of it and he's light side Anakin, he can talk to her. However you want to do it, there's infinite possibilities here. And this episode ended with Ahsoka saying, I hope the Purrgil will take us to the right place. This could have been so easily explained by her telling Hu Yang, oh, I communicated with him through the Force. They said they always follow the same hyperspace route when their life is nearing its end. And with like 2 sentences, this decision makes sense, instead of a joke where she goes, well, hopefully we get there. It's just this kind of dumb stuff throughout the whole season that makes the characters seem like idiots. And for what? Like a half-assed, not funny joke? Episode 6 is another one of the ones that I felt like was a colossal waste of potential. They could have done so many things with it. Like if Thrawn had taken Ezra prisoner and Sabine had to figure a way to get them out. Or if he was causing them so much trouble when they were all stranded that Thrawn had offered to work together with Ezra while they were stranded because they were already fighting for their lives. And Sabine had to decide whether or not to honor Ezra's agreement until they got back to the galaxy, or just execute Thrawn while she can, even though it's underhanded. They could have gone really dark with it and had Thrawn have already killed Ezra, and then Sabine's entire journey been fruitless. And that would have made Thrawn pretty scary too. Since it went the way that it did, it would have been kind of standard, but it would have been fine for Ezra to jump in here and save her. That's the typical thing to do when you're looking for somebody who's a warrior who's lost. Or possibly they could have had Ezra become some kind of rogue and be a leader of the bandits, where they attack her until he realized who she was, because they haven't seen each other in a decade. And now he's got like this little bandit group that he's running. And this would also help it make more sense that Ezra was able to survive against Thrawn for this long without being killed. You also could do the thing where Thrawn was like, execute Sabine right now. I don't care about your word. And then Baylan has to step in and be like, no, I gave her my word, and that means something. And then they have this kind of power struggle between Baylan keeping his word and Thrawn trying to be efficient and killing people who get in his way. But instead, they do the like mustache twirling villain thing where they're like, wahaha, we can technically keep our word and kill them. Wah. And then you have this part where Baylan and Shin are alone because they're following Sabine. And this would have been nice if he would actually tell Shin what his plans were instead of being mysterious and vague. And then we could have Shin make a decision about if she wants to go with Baylan or carry on to bring the Empire back, or possibly even betray him outright and try to kill him. But instead, we get a lot of vagaries and no one really knows what's going on. It's just all speculation. And then near the end of this episode, there should have been a huge emotional moment when Sabine finds Ezra. And if they had gone the romantic route, like I mentioned, she could have kissed him and really freaked out. But again, no romance in Star Wars. But even still, if they're going the platonic route, she could have rushed him and squeezed the life out of him with a hug and really overwhelmed him with emotion. I mean, could you imagine the relief that you would feel seeing someone that you cared about, who you weren't even sure if they were alive, after 10 years in another galaxy in the wild? I wonder if people who enjoyed this reunion between Sabine and Ezra have watched one of those videos online where some soldier gets back from deployment and him and his family and his wife and kids are all overwhelmed with emotion. You can find videos where even the dog's going crazy because he hasn't seen his owner in 9 months. And they were like, hey, Hey, took you long enough. Like, he just got home from the office after a long day of work because he needed to do some overtime. And they've been married for 20 years, not disconnected for 10, unsure of survival for each other. And you could have even done the thing where Ezra is a little bit mad because he's been living with these hermit crab people for 10 years and he's been fighting for survival, and make him a little bit feral, but he's just kind of like space hippie. Episode 7 starts off with Hera's trial, and this would have been a great opportunity to have consequences that could actually be undone pretty easily later on. Obviously, in my version, Hera would have been the pilot legally for Ahsoka and Sabine, but in this one, she stole government resources after disobeying direct orders from the Council and got people killed and ships destroyed. It would have been great if she had actually been suspended here, and then when season 2 or the movie or whatever comes out next happens, we could see her getting released because Thrawn is back. And even though I think the bigger issue is that she actually disobeyed the Council than whether or not she was right or wrong, and instead of finding evidence from the manufacturing plant, she just steals resources. But at least that way, she goes to jail until she's proven right. And that's something. There's a consequence for her actions. And I actually think this reinforces her character when she says that she's trying to do what she can to protect the people, that she's willing to go to jail for it because she did what was right, even if it was illegal. And that's way better than this nepotistic, corrupt government bullshit. Because now it makes her, Leia, and Mon Mothma all look bad. Because Mon Mothma says, I know you didn't get approval for that mission. So it's kind of destructive for all of them, character-wise. The next scene is the one where Ahsoka comes out into the minefield from hyperspace. And again, I think the scene could have been easily improved if we just saw a few Pearl get blown apart and Ahsoka's ship takes damage. And instead, nothing really happens. They all just kind of ignore the minefield. Thrawn pretends like he's smart for not being able to kill her when he knew exactly where she was going to come out of the hyperspace lane. They could have used this to at least damage her ship and then have her flee to the planet surface and the fighters finish off the ship so that she has to crash land. And then this would ratchet up the tension for later of them having to get aboard Thrawn's ship before it leaves, because then they really are stuck with nothing. And instead, they just kind of cruise with the crab people later on to attack the Star Destroyer. We go to Ezra and Sabine, and this would have been a great conversation to have either at the end of the last episode or right now, where Sabine explains everything to Ezra that happened this season, and he gets really pissed off at her and is kind of conflicted emotionally, because he could both be mad at her for undoing the sacrifice that he made, and he spent a decade of his youth, which at this point is almost half of his life, and he could be grateful that she was willing to sacrifice so much to be with him again. Again, this would work better with romantic subtext, but whatever. She also doesn't mention that she believes Ahsoka is dead, which would have been a huge bittersweet moment for him to have Sabine but lose Ahsoka. And then when Sabine hears Ahsoka through the Force, she's a bit confused, and they can both be super happy and relieved when she shows up to save the day when they're being attacked by the stormtroopers and Shin. Like, you could have had all these payoffs just by having them have a conversation on screen. And instead, she just gives like an update like, oh, yeah, the Emperor is dead, supposedly, and like all this bullshit that just leads into the sequels. Also, could have been nice for them to talk about Kanan some and reminisce about some stories they had between the three of them and what it was like training under him and how much of a hard ass he was and whatever. They could even reference some original moments that weren't in the Rebel show, and they just kind of like nod to his existence and then don't say shit. And shortly after this, you get the bandits attacking. And it would have been nice if they killed some of the hermit crab people, or the hermit crab people were actually tricky fighters instead of pacifists. Sabine calls them completely defenseless, and it makes the bandits more threatening and helps justify how Ezra survived if the hermit crabs can fight, because then he's leading a group of warriors who use guerrilla warfare tactics that are a little bit unorthodox. Obviously, again, a million things you can do with it. Instead, the first time we see the bandits, Sabine kills like 12 of them, so they're no threat. And then we don't see a single Noti or hermit crab get killed. And then Ezra fights them literally with no weapon. So all of this just reinforces that the bandits are just garbage. And then once they circle up, there's a massive missed opportunity for Ezra to get his lightsaber back, and you can do the whole dramatic him igniting it thing and the swelling music or whatever. And then him and Sabine just kick ass. I also think it would have been nice here if he was going to turn down the lightsaber, to essentially just have him walk around effortlessly killing bandits without even raising his arms or anything, because he's been so reliant on the Force that he's just become unstoppable with it, at least for the bandits. Maybe not the stormtroopers necessarily. Again, this would have made it a lot more believable that he still put up enough resistance to be alive for an entire decade when Thrawn is his next door neighbor with ships and guns and soldiers. And for the Ezra Sabine versus Shin duel, I think it could have been improved if either Ezra or Sabine had gotten hurt, and Shin had as well. Then Shin could have run off injured and maybe not make it back to the ship and kind of get taken in by the bandits in the finale to survive. Or you could have Ezra or Sabine get hurt and then have whoever doesn't get hurt insist on never leaving the other one behind again. And again, this would ratchet up the tension for the we're not going to make it in time part of the story. And I think it would actually make Thrawn make more sense too, since he already said Shin and Baylan were expendable, to not send any stormtroopers out here and just completely lock the ship down to keep everybody out once all the Jedi are off. Then if you want to do the thing where Shin gets hurt, you could have Ahsoka show up, insist on sparing Shin while Sabine wants to kill her, and then they could have their own conflict and disagreement there. I'm not even going to mention Ahsoka versus Baylan's duel because it was completely pointless. It stalled her for like 2 minutes, and I don't see why she couldn't land right next to the crabs where she needed to be. So it's just a time filler. And episode 8, the finale. Another missed character conflict / opportunity here. Ahsoka and Sabine reunite, and Ahsoka's just like, nah, you're good, homie. It would have been great if she had given her a lecture about how Jedi are required to think of others beyond themselves, which is obviously a callback to the prequels and just how the Jedi operate in general. And then Ahsoka could follow it with something like, but I understand wanting those we lost back, or whatever, because she lost Anakin. You could tie that whole thing in. And then she could say something along the lines of how if she could have brought Anakin back this way, she might have made the same decision too. And they could come to some kind of understanding with each other. And this would have been a good point if Sabine hadn't become a Force user, for Sabine to accept it, and Ahsoka to tell her she was going to accept her no matter what, that she never needed to become a Jedi like her, and it's okay to make decisions that are best for herself, or whatever. You could have the whole conversation you want. So there's just so much they could have done with this, and they just kind of chill. We get like a half-assed apology and move on. We could also have Ahsoka talk about how she understands that Ezra was her entire life, the same way that the Jedi were her entire life. And if she could go back and stay with them instead of leaving, or she might do it, or she deeply regrets it, or whatever. And she doesn't want to see Sabine have regrets. However you want to have the conversation. But they didn't do any of those things, so there you go. Again, fighters show up, and I just wanted to mention that this is another opportunity to have the ship is beyond repair line to increase the tension on the ticking clock that is Thrawn leaving. Right after this, when they ride the Howlers into the base, it would have been nice if one of them had gotten shot like nearby the door or something and injured, preferably Ahsoka, and then you could use this to justify her staying behind in the end because she can't keep up or doesn't want to hold them back or whatever the case is. When they do break onto the ship, it would have been nice to not just be in another open, flat area and get some kind of interesting environment to fight in. Use some hallways with some columns, have some statues, have some supply boxes piled up, whatever. And we've gotten almost nothing involving environments during the fight this season. A little bit in the woods maybe, and I guess Ahsoka falling off the cliff, but that little area where they actually fought was just a flat circle. So it would have been nice to see some different environments. For the Ahsoka versus Morgan Elsbeth duel, I really wish they would have had like a Force, like a traditional Jedi Force user versus witchcraft Force user part of the fight, instead of like, again, just kind of fighting in a flat area and going back and forth and doing the kind of standard shit. It would have been nice to see how the witch magic versus the Force kind of operates if they're going to include it in the universe. When we get the Sabine and Ezra 2v2 with the special troopers, again, it would have been cool to see them work together and tag team and alternate opponents. Maybe even have him use the lightsaber and her use her Mandalorian shit. And they just kind of do 2 separate 1v1s. So there's not really much inspired there. The Ezra getting tossed across the chasm by Sabine thing, I don't have much to say about. But I kind of wish that she would have chosen to go with him since she reignited a civil war to see him again. And then if this show continues or the movie or whatever, it would have been nice to see her have to live with the guilt and realize the consequences of her actions and that her choice impacted and that she has to live with that as the show goes on or the movie or series or whatever. At this point in the image on your screen, Morgan's mission and the stormtroopers is complete. Ahsoka and Sabine are behind. All of them are stranded there. And I'm not sure if I would like this kind of decision, but at least it would have been interesting if once Ahsoka's ship had been damaged, if it had actually been beyond repair when Thrawn left, the stormtroopers and Morgan could have just put their weapons down and they all could just accept that they had to live here together. And that would have been kind of odd, but it could have been interesting at least. If they were going to give Shin the bandits, they could have had her walk in and cut down a couple, and maybe even the leader, and then force them all to kneel. I don't know why they would really give a shit about her or her authority otherwise, but this would have been something interesting about her character if she was just willing to use straight brutality for power and to control others. But yeah, just something I could throw in there. I mentioned earlier she had gotten injured and fled to the bandits. That also could have been interesting for her to become one of them because they healed her or whatever the fuck. I don't know if this last scene with Balin was changed because of Ray Stevenson's untimely passing, but it would have been nice to have him say something out loud at the end, like, I'm finally on my way to blah, blah, blah. So we actually know what his goal was for the entire season, instead of just kind of standing there looking off at Mordor or whatever the hell he was doing on the Mortis god statues. Ezra and Hera reunite, and it's probably the most emotion she shows all season. It would have been nice to get a hug or something from her. I would have at least liked to have seen her do kind of the mom thing where she's like, I can't believe how big you've gotten, look at that beard, blah blah blah, because she was kind of a mother figure to him and the ghost crew outside of Kanan, obviously. And it's not a huge deal, but it just would have been nice to see a little something. Like, her emotive reacting is fine, but again, for the normies, they have no clue what their relationship was. I really hate the line right here at the end between Sabine and Ahsoka, where Ahsoka says, we are where we need to be. And it would have been so much more justified for Sabine to be upset because she reached Ezra and now he's gone again. And Ahsoka to comfort her and be like, don't worry, we'll find a way home. And to really emphasize that they want to get home to stop Thrawn. Like, they brought him back, they need to go back and stop him. But like I said before, I think they're trying to kind of pad their timeline here so that Sabine and Ahsoka can come back and hang out with the Mandalorian and Rey and Boba Fett and whoever else. I think this is all I have to say, which I know this was a long one. I think this is all I have as far as plot tweaks that I think could have helped. Maybe if I really put a lot of time into it, I could come up with more, or if I just want to do an entire fan fiction, which I do not. But I think a lot of the suggestions that I made could have been incorporated into the show in a way to give it some substance and some character stuff and some conflict and some interesting interactions. It really just felt like every character was just there to plot along so the plot could just keep going, but no one really had a reason to outside of meta stuff. And the show was so flat, and in reality, it could have had throwing it back in like the first 2 episode special, and then the show can go from there. But they drug everything out, these huge pauses in dialogue and stuff. This is it for me for this one. If you're still here for some reason, thanks. Like and subscribe and all that shit. All right, thanks. See ya.